You move through your days with your emotional gates left wide open. A careless word lingers longer than it should. A small inconvenience quietly reshapes your entire mood. Someone else's tone, someone else's energy, and suddenly your state of mind is no longer your own. It happens so subtly that you do not even question it, until you realize how easily your peace is being negotiated. If you are tired of life happening to you instead of through you, pay attention. This is how you take control.
Welcome to True Stoic Journal, the path to inner control.
The unsettling part is how normal this has become. It feels like your inner state is constantly being adjusted by things that were never supposed to have that kind of access. Not by force, but by habit. Quiet, automatic, unexamined reactions that slowly take control without ever announcing themselves. Stoicism was built for this exact condition. Not to control the world, but to master your response to it. A steady mind in an unstable environment. Not cold. Not detached. Just grounded. Clear. Deliberate. The kind of inner stability most people never develop, but immediately recognize when they see it. It begins in a space so small most people never notice it. The brief gap between what happens and how you respond. Everything is decided there. An insult lands, and something inside you reacts before you even think. A plan falls apart, and your mind rushes straight into frustration. It feels automatic. Like, there was never a choice. But that feeling is misleading. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, where everything could have gone differently. The problem is not that the moment does not exist. It is that it passes too quickly for an untrained mind to catch. Most people live at the mercy of that speed. They react first, then reflect later. And by then, the damage is already done. Words they didn't mean to say. Emotions they didn't intend to feel. Decisions made under pressure do not reflect who they actually are. It creates a quiet kind of regret. Not dramatic, but persistent enough to slowly erode clarity and confidence over time. But the moment you slow that process even slightly, everything changes. You begin to see what was always there. The mechanism behind your reactions. That space between stimulus and response starts to widen just enough for awareness to step in. You feel the impulse rise. But instead of acting, you observe the tension. The urgency. The pull to react. And in that observation, something shifts. You are no longer inside the reaction. You are watching it. That distance is where control begins. Not by suppressing emotion. Not by pretending it isn't there. But by choosing what happens next. Quietly. Deliberately. Because once you realize you don't have to obey the first impulse, you begin to see how much of your life was previously automatic. The reaction loses its authority. It becomes a suggestion, not a command. But even when you begin to master that pause, something deeper still pulls at you. Because what disturbs you is rarely the event itself. It is the meaning you attach to it. Someone ignores you, and it feels like rejection. A plan fails, and it feels like personal failure. The event is simple. But the interpretation gives it weight. And that interpretation happens so fast, it feels like reality. But it isn't. It is a story. Once your mind creates it instantly, then it believes without question. Once you begin to see that separation between what happened and what you made it mean, you regain something powerful. You realize that not every thought deserves to be accepted as truth. You can question it. Adjust it. Replace it. And when you do, the emotional weight begins to shift. Situations feel lighter. Less personal. Less consuming. You stop tying your identity to every outcome. And with that, your stability deepens. You are no longer being reshaped by every external moment. You remain steady even when circumstances are not. Then there is something even more subtle. Something you absorb without realizing it. The emotional atmosphere around you. The energy of conversations. The tone of people. The quiet tension in certain environments. It all leaves a trace. You might think your state is entirely your own, but it is constantly being influenced. Slowly. Quietly. Consistently. Spend enough time around negativity, and it begins to echo inside you. Not because you chose it, but because you allowed it. Once you see this clearly, you cannot ignore it. You start to notice how certain people leave you feeling grounded, while others leave you drained. Not because of what they say directly, but because of how they see the world. And that perspective, repeated often enough, becomes contagious. So you begin to set boundaries. Not harsh. Not defensive. Just intentional. You become more selective with what you allow into your mental space. Because protecting your state is not avoidance. It is discipline. And that discipline creates a kind of quiet stability that doesn't depend on the environment staying calm. Even if you guard your environment, there is another source of disturbance that follows you everywhere. Your expectations. The quiet assumptions you carry into every moment. That things should go your way. That people should act fairly. That effort should always lead to results. And when reality doesn't match those expectations, frustration appears. Not because something is wrong, but because something didn't go as planned. That gap between expectation and reality is where most tension lives. But when you begin to release those rigid expectations, something shifts. You stop demanding that life follow your script. You start accepting that unpredictability is part of its nature. And with that acceptance comes flexibility. You adapt faster. You resist less. You move through situations without carrying unnecessary tension. Not because everything is going well, but because you are no longer insisting that it must. Still, there are moments when emotion hits harder. Anger. Frustration. Resentment. It builds quickly, and in those moments, awareness feels distant. Most people either explode or suppress it. But both lead to the same result. Loss of control. The difference is only in where the damage appears. But what if those emotions weren't the problem? What if they were energy? Raw. Intense. Waiting for direction. Because that is what they are. And once you begin to see them that way, your relationship with them changes. You do not need to get rid of them. You need to guide them. You take that intensity and redirect it into focus. Into discipline. Into something that builds instead of breaks. And over time, the emotions that once disrupted you begin to strengthen you. Not because they disappeared, but because you learned how to use them. Then the mind does something even more deceptive. It leaves the present entirely. It drifts into futures that haven't happened yet. Conversations that do not exist. Problems that haven't occurred. And somehow, your body reacts as if they are real. Tension rises. Focus disappears. And you find yourself dealing with something that isn't even happening. That is where anxiety lives. Not in reality, but in imagination. The only way out is not through thinking, but through returning. Back to what is actually in front of you. Your breath. Your surroundings. This moment. Because in this exact second, there is usually no real threat. Only a projection. And the more you anchor yourself in the present, the less power those projections have. You stop fighting imagined futures and start dealing with what is real. This is the place where action happens. Where control exists. Where awareness can be applied most effectively. And in that shift, something stabilizes. The imagined futures lose their intensity. The body relaxes. The mind becomes clearer. And what remains is a more direct connection to what is actually happening. Without the constant interference of what might happen next. Beneath everything you have been working on. Your reactions. Your interpretations. Your environment. even your ability to stay present. There is a deeper layer that quietly influences all of it. It does not show up as clearly as anger or anxiety. It does not feel as immediate as a reaction. But it shapes your internal state more than you might realize. It is the need for validation. The tendency to look outward for confirmation that you are doing well. That you are enough. That you are on the right path. It seems harmless at first. Even natural. But over time, it creates a kind of instability that is easy to overlook. Because when your sense of stability depends on something outside of you, it becomes unpredictable. Approval feels good, but it is temporary. It lifts you for a moment, then fades. Criticism, on the other hand, tends to linger. It holds your attention longer. It shapes your thoughts more deeply. And without realizing it, your emotional state begins to rise and fall based on factors you cannot fully control. Someone's opinion. Someone's reaction. Someone's perception of you. It becomes a determining force in how you feel. This creates a subtle form of dependence. Not on a specific person, but on the responses of others in general. You begin to adjust yourself, sometimes unconsciously, to maintain that approval or avoid that criticism. Your actions shift slightly. Your words become more measured. Your decisions become influenced by how they might be perceived, rather than what feels aligned internally. And over time, that adjustment becomes a pattern. The difficulty is that this pattern feels normal. It blends into everyday behavior so easily that it rarely stands out. But when you step back and look at it more closely, something becomes clear. If your emotional state can be changed so easily by external feedback, then it is not fully yours. It is being shaped moment by something outside your control. There is a quiet realization that begins to form here. That stability cannot be built on something that is constantly changing. Opinions shift. Perceptions vary. What one person values, another may not. If your sense of self is tied to those fluctuations, it will always remain unstable. This is where a different approach begins to take shape. Not by rejecting feedback entirely, but by changing where your primary standard comes from. Instead of looking outward for validation, you begin to look inward for alignment. You start to measure yourself based on your own actions. Your own discipline. Your own consistency. Not in comparison to others, but in relation to your own values. There is a grounding in the idea that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. When those thoughts are constantly influenced by external opinions, that quality becomes unstable. But when they are shaped by your own standards, your own intentions, something steadier begins to form. Your focus shifts from how you are perceived to how you are acting. This shift is not immediate. The habit of seeking validation has often been reinforced over many years. It shows up in small ways. Checking for approval. Replaying conversations. Interpreting reactions. Letting go of that pattern requires awareness first. Noticing when your state changes based on someone else's response. Recognizing when your decisions are influenced by how they might be received. As Carl Jung observed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Once you begin to notice it, you can start to redirect it. Instead of asking whether others approve, you ask whether your actions align with your values. Instead of focusing on how something was received, you focus on whether it was done with integrity. This redirection doesn't eliminate feedback. But it changes its role. It becomes information, not authority. Over time, this creates a different kind of stability. One that is less reactive. Less dependent on external input. Praise still feels good, but it doesn't define your state. Criticism still carries weight, but it doesn't destabilize you. Both are processed, considered, and then placed in context rather than absorbed completely. This also changes how you interact with others. Without the constant need for validation, your communication becomes more direct. Your decisions become clearer. You are less concerned with managing perception and more focused on acting consistently. A kind of quiet confidence begins to develop through this process. Not loud. Not attention-seeking. But steady. It comes from knowing that your state is not easily shifted by what others think. That your actions are guided by something internal rather than external. And that understanding creates a sense of control that is difficult to disrupt. This doesn't mean you become indifferent to others. It means you are no longer dependent on them for your sense of stability. You can still listen. Still consider. Still learn. But without losing your center in the process. As this becomes more consistent, you begin to notice how much energy was previously spent monitoring and adjusting to external responses. That energy becomes available again. It can be directed toward your own growth. Your own focus. Your own discipline. And in that shift, your internal state becomes less scattered. More contained. Control is not about managing how others see you, but about managing how you see yourself. After working through everything. Your reactions. Your interpretations. Your environment. Your expectations. Your emotions. Your attention. Even your need for validation. You begin to notice a deeper shift taking place. It is a change in how you see things altogether. A widening of perspective. Because when you are inside a moment, everything feels amplified. A small problem feels large. A minor inconvenience feels personal. A brief frustration feels like it carries more weight than it actually does. The closer you are to it, the more intense it becomes. That intensity creates urgency. It convinces you that what you are experiencing right now is significant. But when you begin to create distance, not physically but mentally, something changes. The same situation, viewed from a wider perspective, starts to look different. Less intense. Less permanent. What once felt overwhelming begins to shrink slightly. Not because the situation itself has changed, but because your position relative to it has shifted. There is a clarity in the idea that you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say, and think. It is not meant to create fear, but perspective. A reminder that most of what feels urgent in the moment is temporary. The things that disturb you now often fade with time. Sometimes faster than you expect. And when you hold that awareness even lightly, the grip of those moments begins to loosen. You start to notice patterns. Situations that once felt significant become distant memories. Conflicts that once seemed important lose their weight. Problems that consumed your attention resolve themselves or become irrelevant. The mind tends to overestimate the importance of the present moment, especially when it is emotionally charged. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin to zoom out. You ask yourself how this moment fits into a larger timeline. You consider whether this will matter in a few days, a few months, or a few years. And often, the answer is clear. It won't. This does not make the moment meaningless. It places it in context. It reduces the sense of urgency that drives impulsive reactions. It allows you to choose your response more carefully. Based not just on how you feel now, but on how you want to remember this moment later. That shift creates a different kind of control. One that is less reactive and more intentional. This space allows for better decisions. When you are not overwhelmed by urgency, you can think more clearly. You can act more deliberately. You can align your actions with your values rather than your immediate emotions. Gradually, your relationship with challenges changes. They no longer feel like interruptions. They become part of a larger process. Something to be navigated, not something that defines your state. You respond. You adjust. You move forward without carrying unnecessary weight from each moment. When that perspective becomes wider, more grounded, more connected to the larger flow of your life, something stabilizes. The small disruptions lose their power. The temporary moments stop dictating your long-term state. And what remains is a steadiness that comes not from controlling every situation, but from understanding how little control those situations should have over you. That understanding becomes the foundation for everything else. Most people will go back to reacting, letting small moments control big emotions, to hand over their peace without even noticing it. But if you have stayed this far, something in you is already shifting. You are starting to see the space, the control, the quiet power that was always there, waiting to be claimed. Keep going. Do not stop here. There is another video on your screen that will deepen this even further. Watch it, and continue building that unshakable mind. And truly, thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.